I am Patricia Moy, this year's conference chair, and welcome to AAPOR's 62nd annual meeting. We are absolutely delighted that you can join us here in Anaheim this week to talk about voting, to talk about methodology, non-response, sampling, mode effects 1, mode effects 2, and many other things. Each year, our conference theme highlights a particular facet of our field, and this year's theme is of polls and policy. If anything, for AAPOR, this is a truism. After all, our work is predicated on the notion that citizens express their opinions, and more importantly, that policymakers respond to those preferences. And although we believe that policy should be the basis for that public opinion should be the basis of policy, we also know that normative ideals don't necessarily translate into these things we call empirical realities, and we see a lot of variance. We see this variance in how public opinion is conceptualized. We see this variance in how polls are conducted, in the extent to which politicians rely on polls, and certainly how polls get interpreted by the public. And in the end, these seemingly disparate processes all work together to shape public policy. Our work is ultimately designed to influence policy, and this afternoon we have 3 experts who will be speaking to polls and the practice of politics. Collectively, they bring to the table, shall we say, 3/4 of a century's worth of expertise. They have earned accolades from 60 years? They have earned accolades from respected politicians, interest groups, media organizations, and of course the public, and I'm very happy to introduce them. To your left, furthest most to your left, is Dave Sacket, founding father and partner of the Terrence Group. This is a highly respected and successful Republican survey research and strategy team. Mr. Sacket has an extensive background in campaign strategy, in political message development, and demographic targeting. He claims that his interest in politics emerged only after his hockey career was cut short by a lack of talent. And indeed, this shift to politics and his work have earned him a place on roll call's list of top 20 consultants in the country. Mr. Sacket serves as the pollster and strategic consultant for over 50 Republican governors, U.S. senators, members of Congress, and state leaders. He also serves as a strategic consultant for the National Republican Congressional Committee. He's the pollster for the state Senate and House campaign committees in Florida, and earlier this year, the Rudy Giuliani Presidential Exploratory Committee named Mr. Sacket and his partners its pollsters. As a matter of fact, Mr. Sacket is flying back to DC on the red eye tonight to have a meeting first thing tomorrow. In addition to his domestic political work, he is extremely active in the international realm. He has served as a pollster and strategic advisor on national and provincial campaigns in Canada, France, Russia, and the Philippines and the Ukraine. Across these contexts, Mr. Sacket has worked on a number of key issues. For example, as a member of the Bush-Cheney 04 polling team, he developed the National Republican Strategy for Messaging on the prescription drug benefit to Medicare legislation. He also oversaw Republican messaging to Hispanic voters in key target states. For Mr. Sacket, public affairs work means work on children's issues. He has spent the last 15 years working with foundations and organizations involved in children's health, adoption, before and after school programs, and abuse prevention strategies. In 2002, he served as the pollster for Arnold Schwarzenegger's successful before and after school initiative. He also is recognized for his role in elective politics and work on issues like Social Security, Medicare, and immigration. Mr. Sacket will be our first plenary speaker today. He will be followed by the gentleman on his left and your right, Mark Mellman, CEO of the Mellman Group. The Mellman Group is a polling and consulting firm whose clients include political figures, Fortune 500 companies, and public interest groups. Dr. Mellman has helped guide the campaigns of some 16 U.S. senators, 8 governors, and over 24 members of Congress, as well as numerous state and local officials. As a consultant to the Democratic congressional leadership, Dr. Mellman has played a very central role in developing strategies on a variety of issues. Newsweek credits him with helping turn Bill Clinton green. with his work on the environment. The Economist has recognized him as the advisor who was the brains behind the Democrats' successful Meta-Scare strategy, and the New Republic describes him as a leading Democratic technologist. The Mellman Group has had a great track record of success in numerous initiative campaigns. For instance, it helped to defeat California Proposition 226, also known as the Anti-Labor Union Dues Initiative, and Proposition 38, the California School Voucher Initiative. It also has helped to pass tobacco control initiatives in some 15 states. And internationally, Dr. Mellman has worked with political and corporate clients in Great Britain, Israel, Costa Rica, Uruguay, Colombia, and the Republic of Georgia. A number of institutions also turn to Dr. Mellman for his expertise. This list includes the U.S. Departments of Justice, State and Labor, the World Bank, the American Cancer Society, and the National Environmental Trust. Dr. Mellman's corporate clients include Intuit, you'll know them as the makers of Quicken, Janus Mutual Funds, and United Airlines. His research has helped to find how nonprofits and businesses can use the internet for online communications, organizing, and fundraising. Dr. Mellman will be our second speaker, and to his left and your right, furthest most, we have our third plenary speaker, Mr. Ronald Brownstein. Mr. Brownstein is a national political correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, the author of its weekly Washington Outlook column, and as of this February, its national affairs columnist. He has been with the Los Angeles Times since 1990, taking only a 7-month hiatus in 1998 to serve as the chief political correspondent and columnist for U.S. News and World Report. Before joining the LA Times, Mr. Brownstein served as White House and national politics correspondent for Washington, D.C.-based National Journal, then moved over to become its West Coast correspondent. He also served in the late 1970s, early 80s as the chief staff writer for Ralph Nader, based in Washington. Mr. Brownstein shares his expertise with the American public in a number of other venues. He has served as a substitute host on Charlie Rose, appears regularly on Meet the Press, this week with George Stephanopoulos, Inside Politics, and Lou Dobbs. He also has reached audiences through one or more of his 6 books. His last one, which he just finished while on book leave, is due out this autumn, and it's titled The Second Civil War: How Extreme Partisanship Has Paralyzed Washington and Polarized America. Mr. Brownstein has twice been named a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and he has received that recognition for his coverage of both the 1996 and the 2004 presidential campaigns. He's received several journalism awards, including the Exceptional Merit in Media Award from the National Women's Political Caucus and the 2005 Journalist of the Year Award from the Los Angeles Press Club. In its post-election review of the 2004 campaign coverage, the Columbia Journalism Review wrote, "Perhaps the most consistent performer was Ron Brownstein of the Los Angeles Times. Given the luxury of wearing 2 hats, reporter and columnist, which he studiously kept separate, Brownstein often delivered to his readers breaking news as well as thoughtful insights. This afternoon, we are very fortunate to have 3 highly respected intellectual friends of AAPOR who will be sharing their insights on how public opinion polls and what we do influence policies and politicians. Each presenter will speak for about 20 minutes. We'll then have the speakers speak amongst themselves, and then we'll open the plenary up to questions from the floor. There are 2 microphones on the floor. So please join me in welcoming Dave Sacket, Mark Mellman, and Ronald Brownstein. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I'm not going to talk for 20 minutes, but I do want to spend a few minutes together talking about sort of public opinion and what happens when you move from the realm of public policy into the realm of politics. For many of you here, the goal or the objective is to truly find out what people think and to get at their attitudes and their views and their ideas. But when you move from the realm of public policy into the realm of politics, finding out what people think is only part of the issue. And frankly, much of what we're focused on is not what people think, but what is it that we have to say to them? What are the messages that we have to deliver them to get them to think what we want them to think? And frankly, a lot of the work that we in sort of the political side of this, that's what we're focused on. When you move from the realm of public policy into the realm of politics, the rules change. The political debate is different, I think, in about 5 different ways. Number one, most importantly, the complexity of any issue is going to be simplified into soundbite form. People have no capacity or ability to listen to long, involved arguments or pay attention. There are too many other things going on in their lives. And so the first thing that you have to do is understand the way in which they themselves will, or you can help them to simplify the problem or the issue or the point of focus into something that is easily understandable in about 30 to 35 seconds. Number two, villains will be identified. This is America. And in America, everything is somebody's fault. And so you cannot begin to have a debate about a policy idea or a solution until they understand what the problem is and whose fault it is. Because much of the solution, if it's going to be effective in the realm of politics, is going to be based on punishing that enemy, on vanquishing that villain, or on limiting their capacity or ability to continue to do you wrong. Number three, and this one's depressing, but it's sort of the reality that we deal with. We have the first rule of politics is that truth is what people believe. And so rhetoric and the messages that you drive become as important or oftentimes more important than the facts. And I think that every single one of you in the work that you've done or in the experiences that you've had in doing research have come to find that when you look at a particular policy issue, when you look at an idea, the electorate may have a very different concept or a very different notion of what the reality of that situation is. And no matter how many facts you try and drive down their throats, no matter how much you try and reframe their understanding of the problem, they believe what they believe. Perfect example of this, and I think one of the most fascinating sort of long-term examples of public policy and politics is the ongoing debate about Social Security. How much is it broke? How are we going to fix it? It's a fight that we've had pretty much, Mark, every decade, for the last 3 or 4 at least, and are going to continue to have every 7 or 8 years in perpetuity. Social Security is in crisis. Something has to be done about it right now. That is a fact as some people come to believe it and understand it and accept it. And there's all sorts of data that you can put forth to suggest that that is in fact true and that is the case. The Social Security system needs to be protected from those who would dismantle it. And while there may be problems in the future, it's okay for right now. That is also a fact, as many people can accept it, and you can put forth various statistics. And so framing sort of that rhetoric in terms of what facts are put forth is very, very important to the debate, and that's how we spend a good deal of our time. Relevant collateral issues are not going to affect the debate unless or until you expend the resources to insert them. You cannot assume that the electorate, that the voter, that the community understands fully all of the relevant issues that go into something. Whether it's the fact that there is a budget deficit in the city, whether it's the fact that there are not enough police officers, whether it is the fact that there are environmental concerns. As a policymaker, you may know that there are 20 different factors, each of which is crucial or very important to this discussion or this debate. And they all need to be considered in terms of coming up with a policy idea or a policy solution. But for the electorate, there may only be 4 or 5 components that they understand, that they believe in fact are part of this debate, and that's all they want to deal with, that's all they want to talk about, that's all they want to hear about. And then finally, and again depressing but true, that the protagonists in this sort of war or contest will spend as much or more time focusing on the problem than on the solution. Because I will tell you that at least in the work that we do and from where we sit, the group or the entity that is going to win the day is not the one that has the better solution. The group or the entity that is going to win the day is the one that does a better job or wins the battle over defining the problem in the terms that are most important or most effective for the voters. If they believe that you have defined the problem in a way that they agree with, a way that they understand, then they'll be much more willing to accept your version of what ought to be done or what the solution ought to be. There are really significant research challenges when we do this sorts of work. The biggest one, and the one that we run into most often, is that probably 70% of the policy proposals that we look at, that we test, that we do research on, are solutions to problems that don't exist in the minds of the voters. We need this tax increase. We need to change the laws with regard to pension systems. We need a new road or highway along here. Why? Why do we need that? I don't understand why that's a priority. I'm worried about my health care. I'm worried about whether I'm going to have a job. This may be a problem to you. It's not a problem to me. You as a politician, you as a lawmaker, you as a legislator ought to be spending your time focusing on the things that I care about, not nonsense like this. And so not only do we have to get them to see the problem in the way that we want them to and accept that it's our solution, we have to get them to care. We have to get them to buy into the notion that they have a vested interest, that they've got some skin in the game of this policy debate. Very, very difficult. So how do you create the demand for this solution? And again, that's what we spend a lot of our time focused on. Also, what's the correct balance between educating and motivating voters? I think that probably of the work that we do in our firm, and certainly for many of those involved in politics, probably the most important work that we do in terms of research is trying to determine how much educating you have to do. What is the fewest number of salient facts or pieces of factual information that you have to give to voters, or that you have to give to the electorate, or that you have to give to the public, so that they understand the problem in the way that you want, so that you can then move on to the more important element of this, which is sort of the motivating messages, the thematic constructs that will help people to move to your perspective. Part of that is also not just what are those messages, but who are the messengers. And I think that a lot of what we focus on is you can find a message persuasive, you can find a message relevant, but only if it is delivered by a messenger that the voter, the public, or the electorate believes ought to be talking about that and is credible within the constraint of that. Again, going back to the Social Security debate, one of the reasons that the Republicans have had so much trouble with the whole idea or notion of personal retirement accounts is that because we don't have a messenger on our side that the electorate overall finds compelling or convincing, while at the same time, amongst those who are opposed to personal retirement accounts or that idea, the AARP is an extraordinarily credible messenger. So no matter how good our messages are, no matter how relevant voters find our facts, if we don't have a messenger that can credibly deliver that message, then we're in sort of a bad way. And finally, voters fear change. When they don't know what to do, when they are conflicted, when they're uncertain of the course they ought to take or what they think, they will tend to simply ratify the status quo. If this is a problem and I've got the solution and it sounds good on paper, it sounds okay, but I'm just not sure, at the end of the day, every time, they will simply vote against it or they will be opposed to it. And all of you, I'm sure there are many of you who've done work on initiative and referendum campaigns all over the country. And we all know that in most cases, an initiative or a referendum will benchmark or will start out at its high water mark. The first ballot number that you get for that ballot question will probably be the best or the strongest number that you're going to get. And the entire campaign is about sort of managing or limiting the erosion that occurs over the course of that contest. And so you've got to get voters comfortable with the idea that the problem is so great that if they do not act, and the way that this impinges on them personally, in their own personal lives and with their own personal situations, that if they don't act, the consequences of that are going to be worse on the other side. Mark will spend a bit of time talking about this. I'm very anxious to hear what he's got to say. At least the experiences that we've had on our side is that we don't tend to spend a lot of time testing new policies or new ideas. I think in politics, the last new idea came somewhere about 1837. And so most of the time when somebody asks us to look at a policy idea or a concept, how do we insert this into the equation? That policy tends to be largely formatted already, or the overall idea or thesis of it is already there. And the challenge that's given to us as political researchers is tell me how to frame this. Tell me how to shape this. What are the relevant pieces of information that voters need? What are the messages that they find both persuasive and relevant? Who are the messengers that we should use to help drive this? And again, there are not many cases where you're sort of testing brand new policy ideas, but it's more, here's the policy, tell me how to make this work, tell me how to get this passed. Or is this something that simply won't fly at all? The use of outside groups is also terribly important when it comes to healthcare and prescription drugs. Folks like the American Hospital Association, pharma, played a huge role. And so a lot of times, by the time a policy gets to a politician, to an office holder, to a legislator, there's already been a huge amount of research done on it by the outside interest group for whom that is a vested interest. And they present that data or that package to the politician, to the legislator, to the office holder, and say, here's something that you should put forth. We've looked at it, we've tested it, here's the way in which you talk about it, the way in which you sell it, and those sorts of things. So that's just sort of a brief framework. I hope we're going to have a fair bit of time for discussion and back and forth and that sort of stuff, because that's where we get into the really interesting things. But thanks, and I guess Mark.
Thanks, Dave, and thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate Patricia's very kind introduction. You could tell it was written by my mother, but I appreciate it nonetheless. You could tell in particular it was written by my mother because she's the one that wanted me to finish that dissertation and actually get that PhD, which I didn't get. But in any event, it is a great honor to be here. Both Patricia and Ron asked me to be rather brief, which is asking me to be rather thin. You can put in the request. Only takes you so far. But I do want to try and get through a few items and then leave, as Dave said, plenty of time for discussion. In that brief time, I want to try and articulate about 5 different ways in which public opinion data insert themselves into the policy process and offer a very brief, sort of one-sentence case study of each of those approaches. So brief, you'll probably call it a war story rather than a case study, but I dress it up a bit. Sometimes public opinion can jolt an issue onto the agenda. That's probably something that you guys study under the heading of agenda setting, but if I use just your taxonomy, wouldn't have anything very interesting to say because you've all written it all. But in any event, healthcare is an issue that received a jolt from public opinion data, a jolt that was magnified by the demonstration effect that comes out of an electoral win. Without rehearsing the whole story of how healthcare emerged onto the agenda, the political agenda, say in 1991, then DNC Chair Ron Brown hired our firm to do some strategic planning for the 1992 elections. We did some focus groups. We heard people talk about problems with healthcare. We asked them personal questions, not just political questions. We asked them, they started talking about healthcare, and we put it in our poll, and we found out that while few people, almost nobody, identified healthcare as the most important problem facing the nation, when we asked people what they were concerned about personally, or how concerned they were about various problems personally, the cost of health care was the single greatest concern of the largest number of Americans. And so shortly after we did that research, James Carville and Paul Begala happened into my office to talk about their campaign for against then Senator Dick Thornburgh. behalf of Harris Wofford, asked whether they'd seen any new issues, described the way health care was working in the polling. They used it, transformed it a bit. If you have the right to a lawyer, if a criminal has a right to a lawyer, everyone should have a right to health care. Used it in the election that was an upset election for Harris Wofford over Dick Thornburg. And the most important political issue really of the last decade got its political birth certificate that way, jolted onto the agenda. The minimum wage, another issue where policy was made as a result of a jolt that came out of polling. Republicans long opposed ideologically to minimum wage. The truth is many Democrats for years feared it was simply sort of liberal Democratic cant, not something that people really even favored. It's just a tired old big government solution. But a lot of us did polling that revealed there was a vast reservoir of support for increasing the minimum wage. And we've seen, as a result of that, minimum wage on the agenda in state legislatures, at the federal level now for several years. It's a big fight. It's a big battle. And it's a big battle that, frankly, only occurred because politicians looked at the polling data and said, wow, I didn't think people favored this. They do. It's a good piece of public policy. Given the support that's there that I didn't expect, we ought to do something with it. A second way that polling gets used in the policy process is really in the form of a glass of courage. There are a lot of votes that members of Congress, members of state legislators would like to cast, but they're worried. They're worried that if they cast that vote, the public's going to come get them, the public's going to defeat them. And we spend an awful lot of our time, frankly, trying to reassure people that it's okay to vote the way you want. The public will support you even if you vote the way you want to vote, which on our side, people tend to worry is the unpopular way. So, for example, we spent a lot of time explaining in the wake of the Republican Revolution of 1994, when deregulation was the vogue, that it was okay to vote against dismantling environmental regulations in 1994. People were against regulation, but they were for environmental regulations. They didn't want to see those regulations dismantled. That was a glass of courage, if you will, for those politicians who wanted to vote the right way, but frankly were afraid to do so. We see it in state legislators. We're just now involved in an effort explaining to members of the Wisconsin state legislature that it's okay to vote for Governor Doyle's tax on oil company profits. People favor it. They not only favor it overwhelmingly, but even when the opponents attack it, we can demonstrate to you that people still favor it. And again, the idea is a glass of courage. The thing that you think is the right thing to do in the first place, you really can get away with. A third way in which public opinion data works its way into public policy is as a corrective. The unsuccessful impeachment of Bill Clinton, probably the best contemporary example of this particular phenomenon. I remember the meeting at the White House shortly after the Lewinsky story erupted. Talk of impeachment was filling the air. My colleague Mark Penn reported in great detail about how every segment of the Democratic base remained firmly behind the president. I was then asked for my comment, to which I replied that Mark was absolutely right. The Democratic base was fully behind President Clinton as long as you excluded every Democratic member of Congress from your definition of the Democratic base. The reality is that, well, already was, that with editorials and cocktail party chatter running at that point strongly against the president and strongly for impeachment, a large number of Democrats had concluded that there was a strong public demand for Bill Clinton to leave office. And that was the dominant view of most Democratic members of Congress in those early days after the story broke. But poll after poll, public and private, quickly and overwhelmingly demonstrated the opposite was the case. Here the polls provided a vital corrective, without which I believe President Clinton may well have suffered a very different fate at the hands of the Congress. People thought, members of Congress thought, the demand for impeachment was great. They learned it wasn't, and their behavior really changed as a result. Of course, sometimes the corrective is not heeded. 5 years ago, Congress was debating CAFE fuel economy standards with polls showing overwhelming support. Auto companies, probably working with Dave, countered with a somewhat unexpected message. They suggested that auto companies would have to stop making pickup trucks, leaving a large, angry constituency, particularly in rural states. Truth is, there is not a shred of evidence to suggest that pickup owners were upset. And rather late in the process, we actually did a survey of pickup truck owners around the country and found that they almost unanimously rejected the view that CAFE would doom their favorite vehicles. And we found that they supported CAFE, supported fuel economy standards, in even larger numbers than the public at large. Unfortunately, in that case, it was too little too late. The image of a mobilized horde of irate pickup truck owners struck fear into the hearts of rural Democrats who joined with Michiganders and the Republicans to kill stricter fuel economy standards. We're having the debate again. We already did the poll at the very beginning of the pickup truck owners. This time, we've circulated it widely, and now the rural Democrats are saying, well, wait a second, that whole pickup truck thing is just a farce. We don't really have to worry about that problem at all. A fourth role that public opinion data can play is to maintain what I would consider at least the proper relationship between leaders and the led. My image of effective leadership comes from a friend who served in the Israeli army. He was taught that on night maneuvers, the person who's leading the column has to walk in the lead, has to lead the column, has to walk ahead, but can't walk more than an arm's length ahead of the person behind him. Because if you get more than an arm's length ahead of the person behind you, somebody else, the enemy, can come in, lead the column off in a different direction and into an ambush. So I would submit it is with politics. An effective leader has to chart the course for his followers, but he or she cannot get too far ahead, or someone else will insert themselves into the middle and lead those followers astray. Public opinion data really does play a role in regulating that relationship between leaders and led. It's been very evident, I think, in the reaction of Democrats to the war in Iraq. Democrats have been very careful to try and lead the country against the war, but have frankly stayed very close to the public, to the people following behind them, to both preserve and to grow the constituency opposed to the president's policies. There are people, of course, on our left, in our case, who advocated much stronger, much more dramatic changes in policy much earlier on. Democrats looked at polls and said, you know what, the public is not there, but we can lead the public in that direction. They knew early on that the president's direction was the wrong one. They knew they could lead the public, but they also knew that if they got too far ahead, they would lose the voters, lose the public, lose the American people, and not be able to continue to lead in that direction. And so the election results that we saw this last year, sorry, can I get a glass of water? The election results that we saw, last year, really, I think, are a tribute to this effort to move the country slowly but surely in the right direction. Finally, we come to the most common use for public opinion data, and that is determining how to present or sell one's own pet policy project for maximum impact. Whether the goal is promoting spending on education or reducing the carbon pollution that causes global warming or enhancing support for affirmative action policies that protect against discrimination, most often, most of us in our business are using polls, using public opinion research to guide message, positioning, and framing. And Dave talked about that in some detail. You all are familiar with that. Our goal is not just to figure out where people are, but to figure out how to get people from where they are to wherever we want them to be. Whether it's on Election Day voting for our candidate, holding an opinion, voting for an initiative or against an initiative or a referendum, holding the view that we would like them to hold at the end of the day. But you all are intimately familiar with those examples, so I'm going to take the opportunity to sit down and to turn it over to Ron.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ron Brownstein, and I'm a crosstab addict. Many of you in this room have probably contributed to my addiction over the years, or enabled it, or at least share it. And so I thought I would start with I was thinking on the way out here that this is a kind of probably a common addiction in this group, but a subtle one. So I was thinking on the way out of a few questions I would ask as a way to start to see how deep we all go into this. I'm going to recognize some of the signs. Do you know offhand the percentage of voters in the Republican and Democratic primaries in New Hampshire who are independents? And do you know offhand the percentage of independents in New Hampshire who currently say they intend to vote in the Democratic or Republican primary? Do you know whether college-educated women or non-college-educated women are a bigger swing group in the 2008 Democratic presidential primary? Would you say the share of Republican primary voters in the 2000 presidential exit polls who called themselves very conservative was larger in South Carolina or in California? Do you know what percentage of Fox viewers still believe that Saddam Hussein was personally involved in the September 11, 2001 terrorist attack? And on that last one, there is data as of yesterday. Now, if you answered yes to any of, maybe all or any of these questions, I would say that you, like me, probably spend too much time peering through the entrails of polls. And if you are that kind of person, this is in one sense a great time for you. I mean, we have a somewhat contradictory period in which all the turmoil of the media business is leading some media outlets to retrench the amount of polling they do. But overall, in polling, as in all media, we are living in an age of plenty, right? I mean, there is more polling than ever. I checked on Tuesday before I came out here on the website Real Clear Politics. Since April 1st, there have been 21 national polls on President Bush's approval, 24 national Democratic horse race polls, 24 national Republican horse race polls, an infinite number of polls in early states, early primary states. And as both Dave and Mark suggested, sort of inferred in their, implied in their comments, it's also become incredibly common for, in fact, almost required for any group pushing a cause to announce it and unveil it with a national poll. I was at an event yesterday in Washington. It was the announcement and the formation of a kind of a centrist foreign policy think tank. They had retired generals there, General Zinni, they had retired admirals, they had former Senator Gary Hart, they had all of these kind of political figures of weight and substance, and the heart of the briefing was an extended discussion of a national poll they had done, which is from which the figure on the Fox viewers and Saddam Hussein can be drawn later in this talk. But that really is indicative of the kind of period that we're in. We are awash in numbers. I mean, sometimes as someone who spends a lot of time following this and reading it, I feel a little like I'm in the Matrix, in those scenes where they're looking on the screen and the numbers, all reality, behind all reality, there's just a series of numbers that's floating down around them. I mean, we are in that kind of environment now. And of course, the question, as in so many other aspects of our information age, is whether all of this information is leading us to more or less understanding of what the public believes, much less what it wants. And this has become, I think, in the same way that it is a challenge for the political pollsters who are advising politicians, it's a challenge for the media, because we are surrounded by all of this polling. And there is one given. I think one thing is very clear, and this has been true, I think, for many years now, is that polling has, in terms of shaping media coverage, outgrown the poll story. I mean, everybody is doing all this polling and writing their own poll story, but certainly the overall framework in which we approach issues is enormously affected by our perception of what public opinion is, where it's going, and how they feel about the choices they are being presented. It affects us directly in the way that we routinely now include public opinion analysis in stories about the actual legislative or political debate. It affects us more subtly in the way that we kind of present the meta-narrative of whatever happens to be going on in the country at the time. They say the Supreme Court follows the election results. There's no question that the media is influenced. The way the press writes about a president is different when they're at 65 than when they're at 35. Just to take random examples of numbers, for example. So how do what kind of questions does this, what kind of challenges does this raise for the media to be in this environment where there is more polling than ever before? Well, the obvious question is, what do you pay attention to? What do you rely on? It is a very dangerous thing to operate on the assumption that all polls are created equal. They're not. And yet we see too often in the media, we have trouble differentiating between those that are credible and those that are less credible. We also have trouble even articulating our standards of what we consider more credible. How do we deal with the inevitable cacophony that comes from even minor differences in question wordings? At this briefing yesterday on this polling, John Martillo, who's a longtime Democratic pollster, was doing the polling for this group yesterday, and he pointed out that if you ask Americans how we are doing in the war against terror, the results are about 10 points less on the positive side than if you ask how we're doing in the campaign against terror. Just that one word. How do we deal with different methodologies? Certainly one of the most contested areas in media polling is, do you weight your sample especially for partisan identification? How do you deal with the differences in question order that can produce differences in result in terms of something like presidential approval? And all of these choices are being made in an environment in which everything is contested to a degree that was not true a generation ago. The whole rise of the sort of talk-back culture on the internet, the challenging of every poll almost every poll, not only by kind of freelance, ombudsmen, but by the parties themselves. We had experience at the LA Times in 2004. We had a poll that was favorable for John Kerry that generated a full-scale attack from the Bush campaign. Because they said that it was weighted too heavily toward Democrats. So we find ourselves in a situation where we have more of this information than ever before, and yet, because there is so much, I think there is an enormous difficulty that the media has in establishing some sort of objective set of standards and how you deal with it. My own personal rule of thumb is I just don't put too much weight on anything, even my own data. I mean, I believe that you need to get a sense of direction, of kind of movement from polls, but to rely too heavily on any single data point, and when there is so much out there, and often it is in conflict with each other, either in the direct results or the slight wording in question, I think you have to try to take a step back and see this. Now, the next question becomes for the media, how do we deal with the extent to which all of this polling shapes the environment, shapes the environment in which the political figures operate? Is the polling kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy? Do we, by constantly telling people that President Bush is at such a low ebb, keep him at such a low ebb, or contribute to keeping him at such a low ebb? Where this is really intriguing now, I think, and where we are seeing this most profoundly, is in the way in which the process of picking the presidential nominees, I believe, is fundamentally evolving before our eyes. We went through the Great Revolution in 1968, after 68, beginning in the Democratic Party, where power for controlling the nomination was taken out of the hands of the backroom and given to the voters through primaries. And there was this rise of Iowa and New Hampshire as the states in which you could create a presidential candidacy. Those voters had the ability to take someone who was an asterisk nationally and invest them with credibility and viability as a national candidate. I wonder if that is still true. In 1976, Jimmy Carter was at 4% in Gallup polls when he finished second to uncommitted in Iowa and won New Hampshire. Gary Hart was at 3% when he won New Hampshire in 1984. But today, with all of this polling that is constantly reverberating through the media, constantly and reinforced by the fundraising number, all driven toward the conclusion of who is viable and who is not. You have to ask yourself if the membrane between Iowa and New Hampshire and the rest of the country is simply broken down. Will 32% of the voters in Iowa vote for a candidate who is at 3% nationally anymore? Or in New Hampshire? Are we, in effect, this year before the primary used to be called, the year before the voting used to be called the invisible primary. I would submit to you it's been transformed into something I'm calling the national audition, in which the candidates are presenting themselves to a national audience of activists and even beyond activists, I mean a fair share of regular voters, on a national basis, and the perceptions that are being formed as translated through the media, as reflected through polls, are going down and shaping the actual environment in which they will compete in these early states, I think, to a significant extent. I'm not saying that the early states have simply become a kind of mirror of the national numbers, because they're not. I mean, there's movement within the tiers, but it's a lot more difficult to cross from one tier to the other. If you're not seen as a nationally viable candidate, I think that it is going to be much more difficult to create viability in Iowa and New Hampshire. So we have a much more interactive process, one that is very directly related to the proliferation of polling and the way in which we are driving this. I would say another challenge for us is that in the midst of all of this information, I think we still have a very hard time reflecting the actual trade-offs that are involved in public policy and sorting out how the country really weighs the choices that it faces. You can ask people whether they support or oppose things. It is very hard, I think, first of all, it's very hard to write questions. As someone who works with our excellent polling unit on writing questionnaires, there's nothing more difficult than trying to give people a fair but reasonably concise, while they're waiting to make dinner for their kids, set of descriptions of competing arguments on different sides of a problem. I think it's very difficult to do. And even when you do it, I'm not sure it really registers. And what really makes me feel this, and by the way, just before Dave used the example of Social Security. Social Security was a perfect example of this. I mean, there were points in the early stages of that debate in which a majority of Americans said they would support personal accounts. But there was never majority support for personal accounts if they meant a reduction in the guaranteed benefit, if you add that second qualification. Now, that pushes it under majority. Now, a Republican might come back and say, yes, but you should also say that if you leave it the way it is, in 30 years, they're not going to have the guaranteed benefit that they think they're going to have. So it's very difficult to get at that. And when I really feel that is when I interview people in our respondents to our poll. The polling unit will, when I write polling stories, when I used to write polling stories, they will make available people who agree to be questioned further by reporters, which is astounding to me that after an hour of answering questions, they still want to talk more, but God bless them. And when you talk to people, when you actually talk to people about their answers, I mean, they're a little like, drunk drivers weaving over both sides of the road. I mean, they don't stay in the box that they've checked off. Many of them kind of have much more complex and qualified views than we can reflect in the poll. And in one sense, that is entirely fine, because the political system does reduce the options often to a binary choice that reflects what we're asking them in the first place. But it is also true, and I feel this very strongly when I talk to people, that there is a complexity and a kind of ambiguity to and a pragmatism to their views that creates, I think, the space for a more consensual politics than we often give them. That there is a willingness on the public to understand that whatever they're saying may not be absolutely right, and that one side is not entirely the repository of wisdom. All right, so I've got a whole room full of pollsters, and so I'm going to close by offering a few thoughts on what we all might do better in the media and in the polling world in trying to explain, as I said, where people are, what they think, what they want. First, I think that we are obviously in a very polarized political era in which the two parties line up in they sort of often in Congress they look like 19th century army maneuvers where they kind of line up in a fixed line against each other and start shooting from 10 feet apart. And so we have these kind of very large blocks of public opinion. I would say because of that, largely because of that, focusing on just the top line results often in a poll, the national number on one side or the other of an issue, really doesn't tell us that much. I mean, we're living in a world with a lot of fixed pieces, and often what's really most intriguing are the ones that are moving. So I think what we often have to go, and maybe this is because of that I am a crosstab addict, I think often to tell people the real story, we have to go beyond that top line and look at what are the moving pieces. What are the surprising pieces? What are the components that are somewhere where they shouldn't be? Where are the Democrats, for example, something that we've been able to do at the LA Times on the immigration debate, which had a breakthrough today. What is possibly the most skeptical group in the electorate about the whole direction of immigration reform that has more guest workers and a path to legalization for illegal immigrants are minority Democrats. They presumably see it as economic competition. When you look in the data, upscale Republicans are all for all this. It's more lawn help. I mean, it's whereas you have minority Democrats that are very opposed to it or very resistant to it. That's the kind of level of understanding, I think, that is often helpful. Secondly, I mean, I think that we need to understand what we're measuring, understand our races. understand our policy questions, and this is especially applies to the media, and ask and obtain the right signifiers. For example, if we are polling on the Democratic presidential race, it is inconceivable to me that you would do this without looking at the education level of the voters, which I think has already proven itself and is almost certain to be the principal dividing line in this race, as in almost every Democratic presidential race since 1968. There's almost always a candidate of upscale, kind of a Starbucks candidate, a Volvo candidate, and there's a downscale, there's a beer and wine track in the Democratic race. We have to know that, we have to poll that. Same thing in anything in a general election. Culture is eclipsing class, not entirely, but it is moving in that direction as a predictor of political allegiance. Nothing, I think we asked most people in this room what one fact they could know about a voter other than their partisan identification to predict how they would vote. It would probably be how often they attend religious services. I mean, we need to be thinking about what our race, what we're trying to, what races we're covering, what are the moving pieces that matter, and then making sure we're obtaining that information. I think we should all do a better job of acknowledging everything else that's out there, especially in the media. I mean, the tendency to just write your poll that day when there are, as I said, 21 others. Often we will write it as if none of this exists. I think we have an obligation, especially when we are off in a different place, to sort of explain to people that this is different than everything else you're seeing, or this is similar. And finally, I would say that we need to spend less time using polls trying to figure out what will happen, and more trying to figure out what is happening or did happen. Less as a predictive tool and more as an analytical tool in the media. Because as a predictive tool, polls have their moments, but they can also be events change, and every pollster always tells me it's a snapshot in time. That's sort of like the equivalent of the Kevin Costner, Tim Robbins scenes in Bull Durham, where he's telling him how to talk to the press when he gets to the major leagues, and just happy to be here, happy to play with my teammates. I mean, so somewhere in pollster school, there's just a snapshot in time.
Actually, our accountants teach us.
The accountants teach it, that's the lawyers, it's the, but if we, there is more than ever, and this is really true on almost every dimension of media now. The question is, how do we sharpen it to the point where we're creating rather than diminishing from understanding? So with that goal, what we're going to do next is take a few minutes. I'm going to take a kind of a journalistic prerogative here to pose a few questions to our two pollster panelists, and then we're going to open it up for questions from the audience. So if that's okay, that's what we will do. Both of you touched on this a little bit, Dave more than Mark, but I'm interested in your experience. Do politicians use polls differently as candidates and in campaigns than they do as elected officials in between elections when they are trying to make decisions on policy, on their agenda and on the policy choices they're facing?
Well, my experience is, first of all, they use them much more intensively when they're candidates than when they do during the non-candidate period. That varies dramatically and widely. I have clients who almost never want to hear about the polling data, and I have clients who want to hear about the polling data all the time. It's a more personal thing, but clearly it's more intense during the campaign period. Second, during the campaign period, we're really we have very concrete decisions to make. What ad do we put on television? What's the content of the speech that you're giving? What's the news event that you're creating? And so we are forced to make choices about those things, and forced to make those choices importantly, not exclusively, but importantly off the polling data. And so there is much more willingness, I would say, to go along with the data in the context of the campaign. When you're dealing with the interregnum, when actually serving, people are, at least again in my experience, people are much more driven by their own personal beliefs, their own ideological predispositions in terms of how they want to vote, how they want to talk about a particular issue. They're willing to listen, and as I said, sometimes it pushes them in one direction or another, but by and large, it's much more self-directed when they're legislators and when they're campaigners.
Dave?
Yeah, I mean, I would tend to agree with that. They have much more confidence in their own capabilities once they're in office. Many of them will sort of gravitate to the one or two issue areas in which they have an extraordinary interest and do a lot of research in that area, whether it's reshaping the tax structure, whether it is environmental issues or those sorts of things. Another thing that's sort of interesting to me is sort of the difference in working in our system versus the parliamentary system. And when you work with the parliamentary system, there is a much greater use of research once they've gotten into office than there has been during the campaign, because during the campaign it's very, very sort of leader driven, and the party and the policy simply follows the sort of personality and character motivation of the leader of that party. But once they've formed a government, and once they know that a non-confidence vote means that they are no longer a government, you spend a lot more time doing research into sort of shaping policy and reforms and making sure that as they are moving along, that they're in good shape, deciding when to put yourself in a position to dissolve the government and form a new government. And so, you know, I think in a lot of the work that Mark and I do, particularly in foreign countries, they're much, much more active once they've gotten into office, and you're, you know, literally at the point where you're doing big, you know, bulky sort of policy stuff on almost a monthly basis.
I told Mark during his introduction, that he was more likely these days to win an election in the Republic of Georgia than the state of Georgia. I want to ask you both, with this proliferation of media polling, what happens in a campaign when the public polling conflicts with the private polling? When the private polling is telling you, hey, we're up, we're fine, or we have a chance in this state, and the public polling says, no, you don't, you're behind, or vice versa. What happens when the public polling conflicts with the private polling? Mark?
It's a total pain in the neck. It occasions I can't even describe how upsetting it is. And not, you know, not just upset, it is a huge amount of effort and work, because candidates see those polls, say, wait a second, you told me this, they're saying this, what's going on? And basically what we end up doing is trying to do comparisons at every level between what we've got, what the public polls have. We strip down our stuff, go back and make sure every piece that we can make sure of, from sampling to questionnaire, the whole piece, to make sure, again, that we've done everything correctly. And it takes huge amount of effort, energy, and hours, and almost never do we discover an error on our part, I'm happy to know. But sometimes we discover errors on the part of others, but rarely do we discover an error on our part. But you have to go through the process, and you need an explanation. You need to be able to tell the candidate, the client, here's what's going on here, here's why this is happening.
As a researcher, you have to have the confidence in your own data, because the minute those public polls come out, the candidate or the senator or the congressman is going to come and chew on your head until you get to the point where you've made them comfortable. I will never forget the longest 48 hours of my life were when Christy Whitman was running against Jim Florio for governor. We were tracking all the way through. It's the only time I've ever tracked on Monday night. I did 300 interviews on Monday night. But the Sunday night before election night was the night we pulled even. And the Monday morning New York Times headline is Florio leads Whitman by 10 points. She you know, metaphysically came at me with a broom. And I literally had to spend the entire day pulling her off the ceiling. But it's taught us an important lesson, and that is that you cannot panic. You have to have the confidence in your data and the confidence in your methodology and the confidence that you've done that right, and you have to impart that to everybody else. Because the minute that story comes out, everybody in the campaign, the candidate's wife, the candidate's mother, the idiot that walks the candidate's dog, the crooks behind the chief fundraiser are going to come at you, and they're going to look at you, and if they see any fear in your eyes, they're going to set fire to the castle. And so you have to be the one to say, we are right, they are wrong, don't worry about it. And I think that the only good thing about it is that the later it comes, the less impact it has on the race. And in fact, I've gotten to the point where I don't really care about public polls that show you winning or losing. if they come within about the last 72 hours before an election, they are entirely irrelevant. The ones that are problematic are the ones that are early on because of the impact it has on fundraising.
Let me ask you a very... Yes,
Can I
Mark,
ask you, because Dave's absolutely right. You have to have confidence, and we all learn that, and we all express it, but sometimes that confidence itself is a problem. I will tell you, for example, during the Kerry presidential campaign, we actually had several pollsters doing several different states. One of the other pollsters was doing Florida, and the Kerry campaign from that individual never had a poll that showed John Kerry running behind George Bush in Florida, not once. And I will tell you, every other poll that I saw, almost every other poll, had George Bush winning in Florida. And we had some uncomfortable, shall we say, interactions over my saying, why don't we just average all these together and get a sense of where we are? No, our data's correct. Everyone else is wrong. We're correct, said this other individual. This was a serious back and forth, and the reality is, for a lot of reasons of internal dynamics, the campaign is sort of forced to go along with the pollster's recommendation, or the pollster's view of the race. Had we spent a little less time and a little less money in Florida and spent that in Ohio instead, we might have had a very different outcome. So people learn the lesson to stand up strongly for their data, but sometimes it's not the right lesson.
let me ask you this sort of related question. And it would not apply to those last 48 hours of fighting off the hordes and defending the castle. But earlier in a campaign, or for that matter, in the period of actual governing, is quantitative data always king to an elected official, or does qualitative experience sometimes outweigh it? Can you say to someone, this is what our polls tell us, but how much are they influenced by how people respond on the stump, letters to the editor, the personal interaction? Do you find yourself ever kind of competing with the daily experience of someone that may go in a different direction than your numbers?
Sure. Oh, I mean, one of the neat new sort of techniques that out there are these telephone town halls, where members of Congress now can get, anywhere between 50 and 150 people on the telephone and hold a town hall meeting from wherever they are. So even if they're in Washington and they have an hour between votes, they can do a town hall meeting and talk and listen to people. Or, 3 people can come up to them in the airport and say, the biggest issue is dog licenses, and so they'll call it.
Does that weigh on them, you think?
Sure, it weighs on them, as it would weigh on anybody. And I think that part of our responsibility as their researchers and as part of their team is to be able to sort out the wheat and the chaff, but be able to demonstrate to them either through empirical data or through other experiential stuff that the things that they're hearing may be relevant to a certain amount of the electorate, but they don't, they're not sort of part of the broader scheme of things. And so, yes, I've got 75 people that are terribly angry about this issue, and if I don't vote their way, they're not going to vote for me. Well, Congresswoman, let's see. Out of those 75, probably only 30 of them are registered to vote. And out of that 30, probably only 15 of them are going to vote in a non-presidential election year. And out of those people, probably 80% of them are partisan Democrats who wouldn't vote for if you sent them a Rolex watch. So do you really think that we ought to change what it is that we're doing and move over to that focus? Mark,
what do you think? Let me give you one prompt there. I was struck in 2004, maybe this is an example, John Kerry put a lot of time and effort into developing a very sophisticated healthcare plan, which polls show was an issue that people were concerned about. But after a certain point, he really stopped talking about it. Even in his acceptance speech, he had only one sentence or two, and it was on a tangential aspect of the plan about tax breaks for small business. Obviously, there was some kind of feeling like whatever the polls were telling him, he just didn't seem to feel it was connecting. I mean, do you run into that? Do politicians just simply say, this isn't working, I don't care if you say it's an 80% proposition?
Let me separate the question in two parts, because
right.
I think the care example is slightly different, because what really happens on an issue like healthcare and a plan for healthcare is voters, healthcare is a very important issue to voters. They want to know you have a plan, but no plan you can present actually convinces them that you have a plan that will work. And that's the problem that Kerry had, and frankly everybody has with health care. You say, I have a plan, everyone says, sure, that plan's not going to work. And with the Kerry plan in particular, it was very sophisticated, very complicated, and I will say our failings, we never found a way to present that plan in the form of a plan to people where they actually nodded their head and said, oh, that makes sense. It was just too, reinsurance just was not an issue that people could easily grasp. Risk pools and so on. But in general, I mean, I would say Dave has either a much more trusting group of clients, or he's a much more effective advocate for his work. I find, honestly, we do compete regularly against members' experience, and as often as not, experience wins out. In terms of what people really, how they think. Much less so in the context of a campaign, much more so in the context of day-to-day legislating. I mean, I will never forget being in a meeting presenting to a Democratic caucus, the Senate caucus, about the issue of FDA regulation of tobacco. Whatever you on the issue, I started out in the first sentence, and you know, senators don't tend to listen very much, and right away I said, people overwhelmingly support this. As soon as I got that in my mouth, somebody said, well, you're not sitting in my office, Mark. And I said, what do you mean? So, well, I'm getting, hundreds of calls every day on this. Well, these are paid patch-through calls done by the tobacco industry. And Senator Conrad, I won't name the first senator, but Senator Conrad at that point says, have you talked to those people? Because I talked to one and told them what this was about. And they said, oh, no, I'm for that. The person on the phone was, misled me into calling you about this because I didn't know what this issue was, et cetera, et cetera. To which the first senator said, well, that's not what's happened in my office. They're dead set against it in my office. So this kind of experience really does dictate to people in very important ways, shapes their perception.
Let me ask one final question, then we'll turn it over to the audience. And we're almost in an even-numbered year, so it only feels that way. We've been doing this presidential race all. So I want to ask one presidential campaign question, which is, I think one of the most striking, perhaps the most striking aspect of polling about 2008 over this last few months has been the gap between the enormous Democratic advantages on almost every generic measure right now. Party ID, who do you want to see in control of Congress? Even a generic presidential question, which do you want to see, a Democrat or Republican in the White House in 2008? Democrats have a double-digit lead consistently, sometimes as high as nearly 20 points. But when you pose the actual frontrunners in each party against each other, Giuliani and McCain in particular against Senator Clinton and Senator Obama, it's pretty much margin of error stuff, one way or the other. Giuliani and McCain were usually ahead. More recently now, Obama and Clinton have been ahead in most polls, although Quinnipiac was out yesterday or the day before in Ohio with Giuliani ahead in that sort of bellwether state. So on the one hand, we have these enormous Democratic advantages, which are totally in line with a 70% wrong track finding, Bush approval at very low levels. And then when you put the head-to-heads out there, they're very different. Which one of these is a better predictor of what the summer and fall of 2008 is likely to look like?
Neither. How about that? No, I mean, Gary
And
King,
why are they so different?
Oh, okay. Now, Gary King once wrote a paper, which I don't know if he's here, but it was the best titled paper I've ever read, which is, if voters are so predictable, why are polls so variable, or words to that effect. And, there's a legitimate question there. I think what we actually find over time is that there are a number of sort of underlying factors, fundamentals, if you will, that really do dictate these outcomes at the end of the day. And in this case, we have Democratic advantage on many issues, and great antipathy to Bush, wrong track sense. We also have sort of the habits of voters, which are fairly, in terms of their actual voting, which are fairly evenly divided over recent history. And basically, at some point in the election, whether the person's far ahead, far behind, in a presidential election, at some point, an event's going to happen, and we'll attribute it to the event and say, oh, it was the debate, or oh, when he slipped on that banana peel, or whatever it is. But somehow, those horse race numbers get into line with the underlying fundamentals. And I think the underlying fundamentals this time have a meaningful Democratic advantage, but still a race that's going to be fairly close when all is said and done.
You go back and look at the last 3 or 4 election cycles before 2006. Republicans did pretty well in every one of those elections based on 2 factors. Number one, partisan intensity. Approximately 85% of Republicans were voting for the Republican candidate, and we weren't losing many of those Republicans to the Democrat, typically about 7 or 8%. And our partisan intensity tended to be about 10 points better than that which existed for Democrats, and they were getting about 75%. We're losing anywhere between 12 to 17% of Democrats to our candidates, and then we were slightly ahead amongst the independents. You look at the 2006, starting in 2005, 2006, there was a huge reverse, and Democratic partisan intensity, Mark, is probably as high as it's been in the last decade at least. Republican intensity is down, and we haven't seen that in a long time. And there's probably about 23 to 25% of Republicans that are disaffected right now. Not a monolithic group. That was one of our biggest problems in the 2006 election cycle. That 23 or 24% of Republicans who were disaffected were not all disaffected for the same reason. There was a portion of them who were uncomfortable about the war, uncomfortable about the president, very uncomfortable about the ethics stuff and Foley and Abramoff. There's also another sort of very different group of Republicans, much more conservative, who were very uncomfortable about the level of spending, very uncomfortable about the immigration reform. We could never bring all of those folks together, but then we were just getting crushed amongst independents. In 2006, I don't think there were any independents. There were Republicans, there were hard Democrats, and there were soft Democrats. And what you're seeing now is that there really has not been any significant change in the overall political environment between sort of beginning in November 2006 and now. I mean, we on our side had hoped that, okay, you took your swipe at us and got your anger out, and we can now go back and play nice. But I mean, those numbers are still the same. But when you look at the head-to-head matchups, you see our partisan intensity come back up, and you see that independents and ticket splitters are willing to look at the two individual candidates and make the decision based on the strengths or weaknesses of those candidates. So the Republican candidates, and it's pretty much all of them. I mean, it's not just the mayor or Senator McCain or Mitt Romney. It exists for most of them. And so they are willing to look at it that way. I think it's going to make for a very close, fascinating election cycle.
All right. Questions from the audience, please. Yes.
Hello again. I wanted to ask Mark and Dave the question that Ron Brownstein posed in your talk, which is thinking about these excruciating experiences where you've had to reconcile your results with data in the public domain. What kinds of publicly available data do you rely on? What do you pay attention to, and maybe more importantly, what lessons on that score do you have to offer to reporters and ordinary consumers who don't have access to the data that you do?
Well, I mean, you're in scramble mode, so we'll pay attention to any and every piece of data that we can get our hands on. I think the first thing that we do is we go back and look at the composition of the sample of the public polls. Has it been polled properly in terms of geography? Is there a correct balance between the gender, older and younger voters? One of the things that we typically run into, particularly with the automated research, is that it underreports older voters fairly significantly because, grandma don't talk to computers, and she's not comfortable with that. And I remember Deborah Price's race in Ohio. It was thought to be, probably one of the more contested ones, and there were a couple of those public automated polls showing that she was going to, go down fairly significantly. But when you dug inside that data and saw that 33% of the sample was 18 to 34-year-old, that in no way conforms to what the electorate was going to look like. I mean, DeWine was already dead. Taft had been dead for months. Turnout was going to be, through the basement there. So there wasn't any way that a third of the vote was going to come from 18 to 34-year-old voters. But look, we would do the same thing anybody else does, is grasp at as many different data points as we could to try and reconcile why their data was different than ours. What was that explanation that we could use? The press, I think, tends to be interested in it but not have a lot of time to report on it. I mean, there aren't that many column inches for a methodological discussion about a congressional poll 5 days before Election Day. God, I hope not. You know, so as much for me, it's really sort of calming down the campaign, calming down those people who are involved and making sure that it doesn't allow us to lose our focus on what we're trying to do. I mean, it is as much or more the management of the internal structure of the campaign that it is worrying about sort of what the public at large is thinking.
Mark, I took your question sort of be somewhat broader than just the horse race polls. Is that? Okay, a little bit. Well, I pay, you know, to perhaps quote, paraphrase Inspector Clouseau, I pay attention to everything and I pay attention to nothing. And I think that's the way you have to really do it. You know, we spend, you know, on whether it's an issue or on a race, a fair amount of time putting together everything that's out there. I mean, whether we're thinking about sort of where's the public on Iraq, with all due respect, we're not just looking at the LA Times poll, we're not just looking at the CBS New York Times poll, we're looking at every poll we can get, every question, and trying to understand, first of all, where they converge, and when they converge, I think we can all feel pretty confident in that. Where do they diverge, and why do they diverge? Is it simply, are they really asking deep down a different question in some way? Is it something about the wording? Is it something about the distinct timing of the two polls? What causes the difference here? And does that difference help us understand, illuminate something about the issue that's underlying? And obviously, you know, as Dave said, look at the demographics. I mean, all the different kinds of constituent elements that go into putting the poll together. But we're looking at all those things, and at the same time, we're looking at nothing else. At the same time, we're trying to say, you know, basically, we try and put all that we learn from the outside into what we're doing, and when push comes to shove, when you have to make a decision, hopefully you've got guidance from your own work to really make that decision, and all the other work that you see out there has gone into developing what we're doing, one hopes.
Anyone else?
I wanted to ask quickly about Karl Rove's contention last year in advance of the 2006 midterm elections that the internal polls from the Republican Party showed that they were going to keep control of Congress and there was no problem, and that all the public polls were wrong. And I'm wondering what was going on, if you have any sense of what's going on with that. Is there a,
Yeah, we focus group tested the message that we were going to get our heads handed to us, and it didn't work very well, so we decided to go with that. What do you expect him to say?
But do you think it's an attempt? Do you think that is there? Well, I think there's.
Look, I can speak to 2006. Mark can speak to 1994. You know, when you get down to that situation, your biggest concern is making sure that your base doesn't just decide that this thing is over and stay home. And in 2006, we understood very early that unless we were able to keep our base motivated and get them out, that the damage that was going to be done to us across the board was going to be significantly greater than it was. And I think that I can, you know, think about probably 20 or 25 significant races at the statewide and congressional level that could have gone the other way if we hadn't had sort of the turnout efforts that we did and those kinds of things. You know, you folks went through a similar situation in you know, 1994, but I don't know anybody of either party that would go out and publicly admit defeat 5 weeks before the elections and think that was a good idea.
Everything Dave said is absolutely true, period. Next point. Not to advertise for Mark Blumenthal here, but I found a very illuminating commentary in pollster.com about this of somebody who I can't remember, Mark can tell the story better than I can, but what Rove was explaining really was that he was looking at a different set of indicia, that he was not saying he had polls that were different from the other polls. He had some other indicators, and those indicators through one previous election, I guess, had suggested one kind of outcome when he looked at those indicators, and he generalized from the one case to the many, and it didn't quite, the data wasn't quite generalizable in that way. But so certainly nobody walks out and says, yeah, we're really in big trouble, we're dead. I mean, you can't do that. And sometimes you look foolish for not doing that, but the reality is you can, no matter, it's just not a reasonable expectation to suggest that someone's going to do that. On the other hand, I really do think, at least Ron can speak to this, I think most reporters that I talk to believe that Karl Rove and others were not just saying those things, they believe that, and they believed it based on non-polling indicators that turned out to be not very predictive.
Well, the follow-up on that, I mean, on your point, and maybe ask Dave, I mean, certainly the belief on the kind of the White House political team, the operating assumption after 2000 was that there were very few swing voters left in the electorate, that the number of people who were really up for grabs was down in single digits. I mean, Karl has said that he believed that most people who call themselves independents really belong to one team or the other, but they don't want to wear the jersey. And I think part of their optimism about this was they believed they were going to have a turnout advantage among kind of core Republicans. I guess I'm wondering, when you look, as you said, Republicans got walloped with independents in 06, 57-39 in the House, in the national exit, and in the individual Senate races. I mean, Santorum Casey was 72-20, something like that, incredible numbers. Do you think there is and this would be relevant to the 08 campaign, do you think there is a reassessment in the Republican Party about the degree to which there really is still a middle in American politics that has to be appealed to, as opposed to these kind of two fixed blocks in which the primary task is to get out more of your side than the other? Do you think 06 has shaken any of that assumption?
Well, I'm not sure that I share that assumption. I mean, I think that there is a very significant part of the electorate that is swing, for which party doesn't really mean a great deal, and they go back and forth, and they can be schizophrenic, within a matter of days. I mean, you look at tracking data in October and see 6, 7, 8 point swings amongst independent voters based on messages, saturating or not saturating. But you also have to think about the difference between presidential and non-presidential election year, and the electorate is going to look very different in a presidential year than it is in a non-presidential year. It's going to be younger. It's going to be all of those sorts of things. But it's that's a group of voters. They're sort of participative, but they're non-attentive. I mean, it's okay if 8% of the electorate really is going to decide whether or not you win or lose. Why don't you send every one of them a Range Rover, and they'll all vote for you, and that's great. But by the time it gets to election, they've forgotten who sent them the Range Rover because they were never paying attention. I mean, they're the most important part of the electorate. Right. You can say anything and everything that you want to them. You can send them a piece of mail every day for 2 years, and none of it will matter till you get till about the 10th or 11th or 12th of October. I think one of the most fascinating issues for us as researchers collectively is going to be the impact of vote by mail and of early voting, and how that impacts how we do our research, when we do our research, and how we, particularly how we look at ballot test data from about the 20th of October on. I mean, you look at a state like Colorado, 30% of the vote is in the bank by the 26th of October. You look at Florida, 1 out of every 4 votes is in the bank by the 17th, 18th, 19th of October. Are we doing as good of a job as we need to of accounting for those people in our samples, in our data, that sort of stuff? And I think those are probably going to be the more challenging questions.
There's a natural human tendency, it seems to me, to turn temporary patterns into immutable laws. I mean, Karl Rove is certainly not the only person that's ever been guilty of that, but you look at the last 4 or 5 data points and you see independents dividing evenly, and you assume forever independents will divide evenly. Well, you know what? Just because it happened 4 times in the past doesn't make it an immutable law. And one should have the historical context on the one hand, but you should also be open to your senses in the present moment. And I think that was not the case. I mean, it seems to me that, yes, we did see independents dividing evenly for the last 3 or 4 electoral cycles, but there's no reason to say that that is a permanent feature of American politics. I remember after September 11th, you and some of your colleagues calling me and say, well, Bush is at 90%, 3 weeks after September 11th. He has permanently transformed his relationship with the American public. Nothing can change that. Well, I'm not sure why after, 3 weeks after September 11th, you're still 90% implies a permanent change in the relationship between a president and the American people. It's absurd, but that is a natural human tendency.
Here we go. Can I jump in there?
Yeah. I thought both of your comments were really interesting in the beginning. And I
Got
would like
worse
to,
over time?
A while back, yeah. And I would like to get some of your thoughts about what the other one said. And starting with you, Mark, Dave's saying when he's trying to sell a policy, simplicity is important, villains are identified, the truth is the messages are more important than facts, and that it's more important to, you want to spend more time defining the problem than the solution. And I'm just curious if would be your mode, or how you would deal with those kinds of things.
By and large, yes.
Okay.
No, I mean, I could add some things to the list about emotions and so on and so on. But, by and large, yeah. I mean, I think all of us start from those same assumptions that simplicity does matter. That look, the bane of our existence, and I'm sure I know we both have had this. You get a client who is interested in catastrophic reinsurance and wants to do 2 hours of a focus group. Talking to people about it's a very interesting problem for them, very important problem for them. But by the end of the an hour and a half in the focus group, people saying, "I give the money back, just let me leave. I can't keep talking about this anymore. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't care what you're talking about. I just want to go home, please." And we get that, and we have clients say, no, this is very important.
That's
Well,
right,
it's
yeah.
very
Have
important.
some more cake.
It's so complex.
Say one more thing.
I mean, we had in the early days of campaign finance reform, you talk to people about the difference between soft money and hard money. Their eyes go. So these are when you get to that level of complexity. The truth is, you've lost people, and that's very clear. And the same thing is true in terms of finding villains. Yes, you got to tell a story. And a narrative story always has a villain, or else it's not, that good a story by and large. So, yes, those are sort of features and elements of sort of all the work that we do.
Okay. And Dave, could you just comment a little bit on what Mark said earlier about the uses of public opinion in terms of, I think he used the phrase cup of courage, was that?
I wrote them down. He said public opinion can jolt an issue, that it can provide a glass of courage, that it can be used as a corrective, that it can maintain proper relations between the leader and the led, and that it can help to determine how to package or sell a policy idea or issue. I don't think that we're talking about things in very different ways, and I agree with every one of them. We can all provide examples. Mark had talked about health care, sort of jolting an issue. Same thing with welfare reform. In 1993, it was not, if you said, what are the 3 or 4 most important issues, nobody would have talked about welfare reform. But once you get underneath it and see the anger and frustration that people had, and that became a huge element of the campaign in 1993 or 1994. And so I don't find anything in Mark's comments that I would disagree with at all. I mean, everybody has different theories about, when you're a little baby political operative, when you're Republican, you get issued your blue blazers and your khaki pants, and you're taught that the world is a certain way. And when you're a young Democrat operative, well, I'm not even going to go there. Out of respect. But you're taught things in a certain way. And I think that my generation, the differences between the ways that Democrat research was done and Republican research was done were fairly significant. And I tend to rely a little bit less on qualitative and a little bit more on quantitative. But because of all the collaborative work that's been done, because of the amount of research that's out there sort of publicly available, I'm not sure that there are as many differences between the way Mark and I do the work that we do than there would have been between Pat Cadell and Bob Teeter, back 25 or 30 years ago.
Besides levels of sanity would be the other.
Mark and I are much better looking, too.
Let me take a step back to the question of public versus private polls and ask you 3 related questions. And first would be,
There isn't any math in this, is there?
There's better than that. when do you decide that you will publicly critique a public poll? And secondly, when do you decide to make your data available? When do you decide to leak it? And thirdly, why should we as pollsters or citizens believe anything you say? With all due respect.
Well, let me answer them in order. When do we publicly critique a public poll? Usually when our clients make us, is the honest truth. I mean, we often have a critique. We understand what's going on. We understand what we think is wrong with whatever poll we think is wrong. Sometimes it's egregious enough that you want to really just on one's own recognizance want to complain. But again, as I said before, I mean, I tend to look at everything, and I think every piece of data out there has some utility, some relevance, unless it's just totally done in an egregiously bad manner. But almost all the data does. And, you look at it for what it is. And so, sometimes our clients force us to go out there and attack some other poll. It's not something I particularly enjoy most of the time. There have been a few occasions. But most of the time I don't really enjoy it, and I try not to do it, but sometimes you have to. When do we make our data available? When it's good for us, and when, again, usually when clients make us. I mean, from our point of view, there's no great incentive to make the data public unless we think as a campaign team, for example, that it's somehow going to influence the coverage in the right way, that it's going to somehow influence donors in the right way, that it's going to influence volunteers in the right way. And there are times when that's the case, and we do release it. And other times when we think it's not going to help us. And that doesn't necessarily mean we're behind. Sometimes we're way ahead and we think it's not going to help us. But whatever, and sometimes we're way ahead now, but we know it's going to be closer in the future. And we say, look, it's not worth it to release it now because somebody's going to say, yes, you're still ahead, and someone else is going to say, wait a second, the trend's against us, which may or may not be terribly meaningful. Why should you believe us? Feel free not to. Why should I believe you? We are, a couple things are true about us. First of all, like you, I assume, I assume this is the case with you, we're decent human beings who have basic, moral values and commitments to accuracy and decency, things like that. So, sort of we're part of the human race. That's one reason. Second, the truth is we have to be right, and other polls don't have to be as right as we do. If we're wrong, we lose our careers. That is not always the case with the public data. And even though we may not be publicly skewered if data is wrong, the fact is that people talk. And so the senator that walks and says, these guys got my campaign all wrong, those people don't work very often in the future. So we have a lot riding on our careers, our businesses riding on this, and so we try to be as accurate as possible. Does that mean everything we do is accurate? To the letter? Of course not. It can't be. That's not the nature of the process in which we're engaged. But when we say something, is it usually accurate and true? Almost always.
I agree with everything that Mark has said. I think that one of the great sort of disservices to the political debate now is that there is so much focus on process. What the consultants are doing, what the next ad is going to look like, who's doing this stuff, that sort of stuff. But if you're going, if that is the environment in which you are forced to operate, and there are polls out there showing that your candidate is getting crushed and that process story becomes part of the debate, you have to involve yourselves in it. And unfortunately, as the pollster, we sort of get put into the position as kind of the expert with the greatest ability to have a legitimate, sort of framework for understanding why that piece of data, why that poll is incorrect or wrong. It's distasteful. We don't like to do it, but it's unfortunately, it sort of comes with the territory.
What's fascinating in both those answers is the extent to which politicians believe that their situation is influenced by the perception of how they're doing. I mean, what
Well,
a
and there is-
threat would be in terms of how it reflects through the media, presumably.
Exactly, and how it affects other actors in
Yeah,
the process.
right.
I mean, I'll give you two examples of different nature. I don't know if there's anyone here for this, but in Michigan, we did a Governor Granholm's race in Michigan. Basically, from the fall on, we were like way, way ahead, okay? The public polls were uniformly wrong about that race, and consistently wrong about that race for the last, say 3 months. But you know what? We didn't think it was to our advantage to go out and tell people that we were 12, 14 points ahead in the race. We are happy to let people believe that we were 2 or 3 points ahead, or even a point behind at various stages of the game, because we got more money into our campaign as a result of that. People thought we were 15 points ahead. We wouldn't have gotten any
Now,
more money.
conversely, I was talking to a Democratic consultant the last week of this election. They felt they were, the Senate race, they felt they were 2 or 3 points behind. Public polls came out at 7 to 9, and they were frantic. They thought this was the death of the campaign, that basically
Well,
it would depress their turnout
Here's the flip
by having
side.
that in the public.
Here's the flip side of this. We did, in 1987, going back a long way, governor's race in Kentucky. My client started out with, well, we say 1% of the vote. Truth is, that was rounding up. The family was sort of more or less committed, but not completely, at the beginning. And, you know, we spent a lot of money. And we did, you know, we had moved from, we were against 2 former governors, incumbent lieutenant governor, a guy came in second 4 years before. And we spent a lot of money. We moved up to second place. A newspaper in Kentucky released a poll about 2 weeks before the election, 10 days before the election, showing us in 4th place. Out of 5. It had been taken 2 weeks before. I mean, it was accurate when it was taken, but it had been taken 2 weeks before, and for whatever reasons, they held it, but didn't really emphasize in the headline that it was actually old data. The truth is, our candidate was self-financing. Had he not been, there is no doubt our money would have dried up. There is no doubt our volunteers would have dried up, and I've seen that in other races.
Let's, one other.
Pushing a little bit on the ethical thread here, there are many circumstances in which there is at least a suspicion that what is characterized as the results of the private campaign polls is in fact not accurate. You can almost, if a candidate shows up as being a certain number of points behind, you can almost guarantee 2 things will happen. One, you'll hear something about how the only poll that counts is the one on election day. And the other is that you will hear something along the lines of, well, our private polling proves that we're only 2 or 3 points behind and we're gaining. What is how often would you say it occurs that either a candidate wants themselves to say, or to pressure you to say, something which is not true about the private polling in an attempt to make a political point? And what is your ethical obligation if a candidate does something like that or tries to do something like that?
Yeah, I mean,
There's a misstate, which your own findings polls are showing.
I think I've probably, you know, I've done, I don't know, 1,500 races in the last 10 years. I can name 3 occasions on which a candidate or a campaign manager asked me to falsify data or say something that wasn't true. I can speak emphatically, not only for myself, but for my colleagues on my side of the aisle with the other major firms and my colleagues from the Democratic side of the aisle. We don't do that. I mean, if Mark Mellman puts out a poll that shows his candidate up by 3 points, and I'm running against him, and I put out a poll that shows my candidate up by 3 points, I'm putting out data that I believe to be accurate. I also know that Mark Mellman is putting out data that he believes to be accurate, that we have the luxury in doing political research of using a series of assumptions about turnout, about the makeup of the electorate, that are at some level factual, at some level intuitive, and that we have constructed our samples a little bit differently based on a series of assumptions. But I can't think of any sort of major firm, either Republican or Democrat, that has ever put out stuff that they know to be wrong or incorrect.
Here's the secret code, okay? If you see a piece of paper from Dave, from me, from any of our reputable colleagues, you can be absolutely sure that that's what we believe to be accurate. If you talk to us and we give you a direct quote about numbers, you can be absolutely sure that what we're saying is gospel, if you will. If you talk to us and we are elliptical, you can bet we are being elliptical for a reason. If you hear it from a campaign press secretary, and, or even sometimes a candidate, you can't be all that sure that what you're hearing is correct.
Part of my question had been what your obligation was, not if you are asked to say something untrue, but when the campaign press secretary says, our private polling shows very different
Well,
results.
he-
What do you have to do as yourself an ethical researcher to deal with that situation?
It is a complicated question. Honestly, it's a very complicated question. Here's what I'll say we do. First of all, usually those quotes are like on background, off the record, whatever, and we don't even know about them. I mean, that's honestly the case. I will say when reporters call me and say, this is what they said, is this true? If it's not true, I say on background or off the record, no, it's not true. On those rare occasions when somebody's put out something that is, I mean, I once had a candidate who actually went out and said something on the eve of an election that was completely untrue about our polling. And, you know, basically, I mean, I talked to the campaign, we had a conversation, I called the number of reporters and said, you know, misspoke. I don't know why, I can't explain it, I haven't talked to him about it, and I was careful not to talk to him about it, so I couldn't say why he had done it, but I hadn't talked to him about it, that was true. But, you know, knowing that situation sort of knowingly happened, very rare.
Yeah, if we have an ethical responsibility to make sure that, number one, the data, any data we put out is accurate, and number two, that it is accurately represented. And as distasteful as it would be if somebody on a campaign or somebody involved in a campaign misrepresented the data that we had or suggested that it was significantly different, you know, I think we'd have an obligation to correct it. And you know, I've only had to do it, you know, maybe once or twice. That's why I don't talk to the press, period, ever. If the firm has to put out a memo, that's fine. You know, when I got my little khaki pants, a brilliant man named Tom Josefiak said to me, "Kid, nobody should ever know who you are unless they're supposed to know who you are." And I've taken that very much to heart, and so, but we do have an ethical responsibility. You can't have incorrect data out there, period.
So I guess I don't need to give you my card then, huh? Here, yeah.
Yes, I have two questions. First is, what are your opinions as being a partisan pollster about writing a objective instrument for your client that serves the best interest of your client? How difficult is that? What are the challenges there? And then the second question is that some public polls I've seen are beginning to even be released the weekend before elections. At what point do you think the public polls, that kind of being released as having an impact, not just reporting on the race, but trying to have an impact on the race?
Yeah, you know, my experience over the last 15 or 20 years is that I have never seen a public poll released, you know, within 7 or 8 days before Election Day change the result of that election. I mean, virtually everybody who is going to vote has already made up their mind, and the only opinions that might be changed are those people who are very, very low propensity voters. One of the things that Mark and I do, particularly in our tracking in October, is ask a question near the end, irregardless of who you intend to vote for, who do you think is going to win the election? And watching the movement in that number amongst the attentive the non-attentive participatives, you'll see that bandwagon impact, but that bandwagon impact tends to come somewhere between 10 and 6 days before Election Day, and not much beyond that.
I get to pretend I'm a columnist, so I get to like say things in a writing I do. I coined, really a great pleasure, Mellman's first law of aphorisms, okay? Which is for every aphorism there is an opposite and equal aphorism. Absence makes the heart grow fonder, out of sight, out of mind. I mean, you can go through these, it's, you know, always true. So we have a bandwagon effect, everybody wants to be with a winner. We have an underdog effect, everybody loves to be an underdog. We have both aphorisms. My guess is they're probably both equally untrue, and probably net out even. So I don't really think that the polls directly influence at the end of the race. As I said before, they can have an indirect influence, and you see that now. I mean, the truth is, if Joe Biden were, you know, at 30% instead of at 3%, he'd be raising a lot more money. That's just a fact. Now, you know, at this point, the truth is, if somebody came out with a poll showing them at 30 while everybody else has them at 3, it would probably be dismissed, and properly so. But that's not the poll. That's the reality that's really having an impact sort of on where he is. I forgot the first question, but
Well, speaking of reality, we have to close it up. But I did want to end by circling back to one of the questions that I asked, which was, what percentage of Fox viewers believe that Saddam Hussein was directly involved in 9/11? Data as of the first week of May, 35%. So it shows you that, you know, what we talk about reality and how that
This
shapes.
is what people believe.
Yeah, it's what people believe. I mean, and you know, the ability to sort of break in through the assumptions and the presumptions of the electorate is sometimes more limited than you think. Anyway, listen, thank you very much, and appreciate your time and interest.
Good to see you.
Please do join us for our new member reception somewhere out there.
Great job.
Thank you.
I thought the most interesting thing was the qualitative versus quantitative. That was really, it's still, because I got to think that one person coming up to you in the airport